So continuing with the Australia trip, you've already seen Albany. Now we're going to be in Perth, or more accurately, as you can see from this, we're actually leaving Perth almost immediately for the happiest little island. Yes, this is Rottnest Island, rather more famously in the wider world known as the home of the Quokka, which is this wonderful little creature here. Rottnest Island sits just to the west of Perth and Fremantle and constitutes the first part of the Perth-Fremantle area's maritime heritage that we're going to look at. Look at his happy little face. Now, upon arriving, there's the ferry in question just leaving us on Rottnest Island. Perhaps we need to explain quite why the British Empire and the Australian government decided it was time to put a bunch of heavy artillery on an island full of tiny marsupials. The answer was threefold. Firstly, there were some existing shore batteries in the Perth-Fremantle area, but as you can see from this, they didn't exactly cover a particularly huge amount. Additionally, ships had gotten somewhat more capable, and so these relatively small, short-range Victorian-era guns probably wouldn't hurt them even if they did get close enough to be hit. On top of that, the Australian Navy, whilst it still existed and had a number of capable ships in it, did not possess any capital ships anymore with the demise of the battlecruiser HMAS Australia. And finally, the threat had evolved. Back in the 19th and very early 20th centuries, the only real threat to Australian ports was Russia, and Russia's Pacific Fleet, well, let's just say they didn't come to a particularly good end in 1905, twice over. And even before that, the Pacific had never been Russia's main area of focus, so a few shore batteries to deter the occasional small raider were fine. But by the 1930s, the primary threat was Japan, and Japan did have capital ships, and of course, being where it was, the Western Pacific was Japan's major, if not only, major focal area. And so it was decided that although in the event of war the Royal Navy would come and assist, it wasn't necessarily guaranteed that the Royal Navy would be able to make it to a specific area that was being targeted by the Japanese fleet before they actually got there, and so bigger guns were needed. And so in 1935 they started construction not on guns, but on a light railway. As you can see here, this is one of the two light diesel locomotives they brought in to run on said railway, having chosen Rottnest Island as the particular location where they're going to establish the gun battery because, as I said, it was out to the west, and therefore the distance from Perth afforded the guns a little bit more effective range to reach out at targets that might be approaching Perth before their guns could be in range of Perth and Fremantle themselves, but with no infrastructure to move anything heavier than what you could carry with a man or a mule, they needed this to be built first. And of course, it wasn't just about taking stuff up to the areas where they were going to put heavy guns. You also had to take stuff back down, like all the earth and rock that you were moving out of the way. Because, of course, you aren't going to have just guns and ammunition lying out in the open, apart from anything between the rain and the heat that you get in Perth. Everything would decay very quickly, but it would also be a fairly obvious target for anything you were engaging. And, well, as you can see here, there were some fairly hefty guns being brought in because they were expecting some very hefty targets. This is a 9.2-inch gun in transit up the little railway system. Now, why a 9.2-inch? Because, of course, you might be thinking this is the mid-1930s. The Royal Navy scrapped 12-inch and 13.5-inch armed ships relatively recently. Why not use some of those? Well, firstly, there are limits to what even the light railway can transport, and those guns would be considerably heavier, but also, bear in mind that the 12-inch ships had pretty much all been scrapped in the early 1920s, and the very last of the 13.5-inch ships, like the battlecruiser Tiger, had still gone to the breakers considerably before 1935, and it was very unlikely that any of those guns, or many, would be found intact. Certainly after the breakers yards had gotten to them, whereas the 9.2-inch guns, for various reasons, had already been used in coastal defence batteries and stuck away in various stashes around the Empire, and so they were available, they were fairly powerful, and they could be moved relatively easily. Now, when the gun batteries were all decommissioned, as they would be in the early 1960s, they discovered that compared to the scrap value of the bigger guns, because there were some smaller 6-inch batteries as well, the big guns, it just was not cost efficient to dismount them, truck them all the way across Rottnest, even using the light railway system, back onto a ship and take it back to Perth for scrapping. The entire cost of that operation would be more than the scrap value of the guns were worth, and so they were left in place, which meant that in the 1990s, when they decided to redevelop the whole area as a tourist attraction, the railway bed and the big gun batteries were still there and could be, relatively speaking, easily reconditioned. And with the light railway reconditioned and a couple of passenger cars introduced, you could make your way relatively easily and in comfort all the way up to the top of the hill in roughly the middle of the island, where the gun batteries are in fact based. There is, as you can also see just behind the car there, a path if you want to cycle or walk up there. I don't know who would, but we saw some people who did, mad as they might be. I mean, there's a perfectly good railway here. Apparently it's something to do with fitness, but I thought exercise involved charging around in suits of armour swinging swords, but shows what I know. And swinging around, you can see to the left the rise of the last bit of the hill that goes up to the main gun battery, and the view out kind of to the northwest-ish of Rottnest Island. So you can see there's not really much in the way of hills past this point, and also having this fairly central location is quite useful because it means that if an enemy fleet does show up, and they are perhaps going to try and land troops to silence the guns, well, then they've got to land a relative distance further out, which means that the garrison can make ready a ground defence against incoming incursions, whilst obviously the main guns can continue to engage shipping, which is a little bit better perhaps than having the guns right on the edge of the island, which is obviously where they could be engaged immediately by landing troops, which would suppress them earlier. And here is the surviving battery itself. As you can see, it is partially recessed into a big, essentially concrete barbette, and has a rather nice boxy turret appearance, albeit that this is not particularly thick steel. This is more of a weather shielding and splinter proofing box, as opposed to if you look at some of the turrets that the similar guns were mounted in the pre-World War I and World War I periods, you'll see that those are somewhat differently shaped because they have considerably better protection. And that's not necessarily as mad as you might think, because whilst those of you who've watched the channel for a while will know that I'm not the world's biggest fan of coastal fortifications as thoroughly effective weapons, the one thing they do have going for them is that because they just have to be the gun and the turret or the mounting, they are very, very small targets when they're set up like this, as opposed to in big forts. And that makes them quite hard to hit, because even a relatively accurate battleship salvo is accurate in terms of hitting a battleship that might be several hundred meters or quite a few hundred feet long, as opposed to, something 20 or 30 foot across like this. And around here at the back is part of the loading mechanism. This is in fact a combination rammer and shell-ammunition tray. But don't worry, we're not talking about cordite charges sitting right out here under this rather nice metal sunroof. This bit that's actually fully out the back of the turret is in fact mostly the rammer. So the hoist that brings up the ammunition is on the left-hand side of the turret. That would bring the ammunition up. It would then be fed backwards, sitting on the rammer, and then the rammer, the tray, etc., the whole thing swings on this big arm, as you can see, heads over to the right, and then that will engage with the gun. The rammer then actuates, shoving the charge or the shell or whatever it is that happens to be in front of it into the gun, and then can repeat the process for the remaining sections of the ammunition. Obviously, you feed the shell in first, followed by the two bagged charges. The whole thing is supposed to be hydraulically powered, and the electrical motors that drive the hydraulic pumps are below. However, once you get into the interior, you'll see that there are plenty of hand cranks in all sorts of positions, which allow you to actually manually operate the entire gun platform if you need to, if for whatever reason electrical power or the hydraulics themselves have failed in some way, shape or form, whether that be shrapnel damage, someone's hit the generators somewhere else, or just general mechanical failure, all of which could happen just when you don't want them to. But since we've seen the two interesting things that are poking out either end of the big green metal box, let's go inside and have a look at some of the more interesting contents of said big green metal box. Fluorescent lamp, by the way, that you can see there, not an original feature. You can, however, see why it's needed, because apart from the door and the side, this little vision hatch on the right is pretty much the only other consistent source of lighting. Now, one of the first things you'll see is this dinky little thing. And yeah, this really is a very, very small shell. This is not a 9.2 inch shell by any stretch of the imagination, but it is used, or was used, in this particular gun, because the 9.2 inch shell weighs about 380 pounds, which is just over 170 kilos for those of you working in metric. But obviously, to test fire the gun, there would be a lot of wear and tear caused by this. And unlike ships, you can't take Rottnest Island into harbour to get the gun relined or replaced. And so they took a Hotchkiss gun, milled it very carefully so it fitted precisely inside the 9.2 inch barrel, and they used that for most of the practice shoots that the gun did. Not all of them, but the majority of them. And this Hotchkiss barrel just so happened to be a 6-pounder, and thus this is a 6-pounder shell. So this is the kind of shell that you would fire from the 9.2 inch gun, but only as a practice round for general training. You could also fire a full-size 9.2 inch shell, but use a half charge, because this particular type of 9.2 inch gun, in common with many others, used 2 bagged charges to make up a full charge. So you could just use the one, which would result in a lower pressure. The shell wouldn't go as far. But if you needed to practice loading a full-size shell and so forth, but you didn't want to put as much wear and tear on the gun as a full charge would, then a half charge would do. Now you can see here the breech end of the gun itself. Now, you may recall from the Albany, get that right, video, that it was actually raining when I got to Australia, and the rain was still coming and going when we went to visit Rottnest. That's why in the wider pictures you've seen there were a fair bit of clouds, although it did stay mostly dry and occasionally sunny while we were on the island. And that's why there's this tarp in there, because they were using that to obviously cover the areas that water could get into the turret, to make sure they didn't have to do too much cleaning and maintenance every single day. Fortunately, this particular part of the gun, as you can see where the paint has worn off, is mostly bronze, so very unlikely to rust anyway, but there's plenty of steel parts you can see in the background as well. And taking a slightly wider view, you can see in the middle left there, that's the other end of that big swinging arm loading mechanism that you saw sticking out the back earlier on. Just to the top right, you can see there's that little viewing window. We'll have a bit of a closer look up there in a minute. And at the moment, there's a 9.2 inch armor-piercing shell sitting there ready to be loaded as soon as the rammer can be engaged. You can also see the driving band of the shell down there at the base. And this perhaps shows the best interior shot of how that loading mechanism works. You can see there's a hoist there, so ammunition comes up, feeds in, the whole thing swings down to engage with the tray, and then everything can be rammed up into the gun. So this area on the left, where you can just about see somebody's arm poking through, this is the area you don't want to be, because that's where this arm is going to swing down in normal operation for the gun. And this is looking up the gun barrel. If it wasn't obvious, if you just look to the bottom left, you can see a little bit of the interrupted screw engagement section, which tells you that we are in fact at the breech end. Then of course you've got this smooth area, so this is the breech where the charge is going to sit, and then you can just see at the very core of the picture the rifling beginning further up the gun barrel. So that's where the shell's going to be when the driving bands are going to engage, etc. and so on. That transition point is obviously somewhere in this little black area, but the sunlight pouring down from the other end of the gun barrel has put a little bit of contrast between light and shadow there. And this is a marking you'll find all over this particular gun mounting. As you can see, it means BL, so it's breech loading, 9.2 inch. And then you'll see you've got Mark 10, Mark X, Roman numeral, and then you've got X with an uppercase V, or Roman 5, and then another X, and although you can't quite see it in this, you will see it on a lot of the other markings around the gun. That should be either X, i.e. Mark 10 star, or Mark 10 with a little X on it in case of the asterisk. So this means that you're looking at a breech that can service various versions of the Mark 10 gun, which means it's a 9.2-inch 47 caliber weapon. You can see this particular section has been made by EOC, that's the Elzic Ordnance Company, in 1901, so it's a pretty old gun even by the time it's being installed at Rottnest. And you can see that this was originally number 185, but it's been scratched out and re-stamped with a 177, which again is common either in scratched out form or in whole form across various markings in the gun. I suspect this has something to do with the liner, because almost everywhere has this scratch out of 185 with 177 on it, except for the gun liner itself, which says breech loading 9.2-inch wire 10 number L-177 EOC. So I think when they've relined the gun, it's been also renumbered. Now, working our way forward, this is the business end of the gun, as you can see, looking out through our little forward viewing point. Now, you might notice, of course, that there's no big rangefinder sticking out of the sides of the turret the way you would find on battleship guns and so forth. So you'd be relying on local spotting and range finding elsewhere. There are, in fact, some of the remains of a depression rangefinder elsewhere in the museum, but this is also where you could look out and spot if you were actually within the turret itself, and the turret would have its own fire control equipment if the separate spotting stations took a hit. But this gives you an idea of what the Mark I human eyeball can see looking out to the west of Rottnest Island. And this is what the station immediately behind that viewport looks like. So you can see there's the receiving element for a telescope to be mounted here. Obviously, they've taken the telescope away. That's on the top middle portion of the picture. And in the middle right, you can see these sort of half-completed areas. This is where the receiver dials for the fire control system would normally come through, assuming that you were using the spotting and fire control station for the gun battery itself as opposed to local control. But of course, those mechanisms were lost at some point during the gun's inactivity in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. More specifically, the right-hand side is where bearing information comes in, because roughly where I'm standing to take this picture is the manual traverse wheel, whereas on the left-hand side of the gun, that's where the elevation details come in, and on the left-hand side is the corresponding elevation wheel. And just to the left of the picture, left bottom, you can see an element of the hydraulic controls. So this is why the data is coming in at 2 points, because you'd have a man reading the data, and then he would be relaying it to the person behind him, who would then be making the corrections, obviously initially with hydraulic power, using levers and buttons to get the gun to go where it needs to go. And if that fails, he can take a step back to the manual backup mechanism. But these days, this is what passes for the turret's crew. But if you go down through a hatch in the floor, or if you're a bit lazy, you can go out the side of the turret, down and round into the normal entrance of the concrete barbette, you actually get a pretty good view of the workings of the gun below. So these are bits that you wouldn't normally see even on a museum ship, unless you're really lucky, and sometimes not even then, because these parts on ship-mounted guns are usually quite difficult to access, whereas here they're just kind of in a big concrete and steel-roofed shed. Here you can see there is obviously a 9.2-inch shell being moved around and a cordite charge, so we're one level below. So this is the lower part of the hoist mechanism that you saw the top end of back up in the turret, and you can see roughly where it's positioned compared to the turntable that the whole thing turns on. So charges, as you can see, the cordite charge here and the shell, which you saw in the previous picture, they're loaded in, and then this box assembly takes them up to the gun. And once again, I have to emphasize, this is a near unrivaled opportunity to easily look at the rotation mechanisms of a heavy naval gun turret, because whilst these mechanisms in and of themselves are nothing particularly special, rack and pinion, cog and tooth, whatever you want to call it, exists on loads of preserved museum ships, in most of them this would be sitting just inside a very heavy armoured barbette, so actually getting access to see this would be difficult. And once you do get to see it, if you're lucky enough to do so, you have to light the thing, and you're only going to see part of it because there'll be other bits and pieces in the way. Whereas here, this is probably the easiest part of the entire mount to see, because you're in a nice big open space in the concrete portion of the emplacement, And so for any naval historian or naval history enthusiast, definitely worth a look to see how it all works. Or, to be honest, if you're researching the 9.2-inch gun itself, this is pretty much the best place to see how the rotation mechanism is actually going to function. Here, for example, are some of the valves that you can use to control the flow of pressure to various portions of the gun. So on the left, you have the rammer pressure. The upper valve there is not actually labeled, so I'm not sure what it connects to entirely. Then the next one is the gun washout system. Then you've got the elevating mechanism, which has lost its key, and then the hoist system. So you can close all of those down, and everything's nice and inert, but once you want to bring everything up to speed, you can individually set these systems, which of course also means if there's a fault in any one of these systems, you can isolate it without necessarily crippling the rest of the gun. So, for example, since it's lost its key, let's say the elevating hydraulic system has taken some kind of hit, maybe a bit of shrapnel, so the hydraulic system's not going to work anymore. Fine, we'll shut that off, but that doesn't mean we can't use the hydraulics to wash the gun out after every shot, air or water, depending on what mechanism is installed. We can still use hydraulic power to get ammunition to the gun, and we can still use hydraulic power to ram the ammunition into the gun. It just means for elevation, someone's going to be cranking on a wheel. Now, because you're talking about concrete and rock immediately below the gun, you can't have a freely rotating hoist the way you might have in certain types of warship. You have a magazine hoist, which is fixed off to one side, and then you have that final hoist that we saw earlier taking the ammunition up to the gun itself. This is how you get the shells in particular from the hoist over to the gun, because the charges, you can probably carry them. That's not a problem. The shells, on the other hand, well, we already established they weigh a little bit over 170 kilos. You're not moving that by hand very easily. So you have this little trackway and this little cart. Shell goes on cart, and you chase the final hoist around and slot it in to the hoist so it can go up and be fired. And whilst obviously these are inert rounds, they do weigh pretty much as the originals do. You know, I had to find out. So yes, you can rotate and roll them, but they are not moving if you try and lift them in any way, shape, or form. Yes, I'm one-handing it, but using the principle of levers, if that thing weighed anything close to a liftable weight, it would have shifted upwards somewhat. Here's another transport trolley, and this is in the side of the emplacement. This is where the actual hoist up from the magazines is coming. So it's a little bit of a complex and involved procedure, because the little cart you saw earlier, that runs around on the rails that go around the emplacement. So you'd have the magazine sending the shell up on the hoist, that arrives up here, then that moves onto this thing, which you can see, which doesn't need to run on the rails, which can then be moved over to the little rail cart. Or I suppose if the gun is really nearby, you could try loading it directly. And here's a cache of cordite charges. Obviously, these are all inert, but these are stored in their cases, and the cases, which obviously help prevent them from decaying and also prevent flash getting to them, they are stored in a box, which you can see is partly there, and that box is then stored in this little concrete section, which has metal doors. So although they are there ready to be used if the gun is called into action without having to draw up more charges from the magazine immediately, they are still pretty safe from flash in everyday use. And as you can see, because you have 2 of these per shot, you have 5 shots worth of charges here. And as with the ready charges, you also have ready shells, albeit in this case, the ready shells are stored just on a very simple concrete lip inside this part of the emplacement, because of course shells are much less sensitive than the charges, so just storing them out in the relative open is fine. Although as you can see, these 2 are replicas. The paint's flaked off a little bit. I believe they're cast out of plaster. And what all that added up to was this. So you can see the various shorter range coastal installations around Perth, Fremantle and other relevant areas all there on the right. And then you have Rottnest Island. The 6-inch gun battery at Bickley is in the orange circle. And then this big red circle that actually goes slightly below and above this picture shows the range of the 9.2-inch guns on Oliver Hill, which is what we've been looking at. So you can see the benefit of this installation means that it can cover Perth, Fremantle, all the approaches around it, and a lot of the approach to the west in a very broad arc. And of course, being where it is, it can turn 360. So a fleet that's coming in from the west, north, or south can be engaged. But if the fleet chooses for whatever reason to try and ignore the Rottnest Island installations and move directly in to attack the harbour, they're still going to be well within range of this 9.2-inch gun. Now, this is a gun battery, so there were multiple guns. There were, in fact, 2 installations, and you can see this is how it all works for the installation as a whole. So we've just been up in the gun, you can see there at the top right, and the immediate area just below the gun house. But, as you can see, the shell stores and the magazines are even further down, and then there's a long tunnel which goes all the way down to an engine room, which is well away from the gun platform, and as you can see has a concrete shield over it. Now that's partly to isolate it so that the power can be supplied to the gun and to other parts of the battery, even if the gun itself takes a direct hit, and partly also because, as you can see, it's in the base of the valley between the 2 guns, so it's equidistant, able to supply power to both guns at once. And of course, all of that means that it's time to go and have a look into some of the even deeper parts of the facility. So you can see by the time we actually left the gun, the weather had cleared. To be fair, the clouds were moving fairly quickly, so it was a lovely little day. And we're going to head down the stairs, which are just to the bottom right, to re-enter the facility a level further down. Because unfortunately, we are neither 9.2-inch shells nor 9.2-inch charges, so we won't fit in the hoists. So as you head down through the tunnels, you can see there on the left, there is a shelter area for the crew. This isn't the actual crew shelter where they could be if everything was under heavy bombardment. This is, I think, just outside the casualty clearing station. So that would be just to the left ahead of us. And if there were any casualties, they could be brought in and laid out on this bench, which folds out. Or if there aren't any casualties, this is a very good way of passing each other because this is a fairly narrow tunnel. But as you continue along, you can see we are in fact approaching the shell room. So let's go inside there. Now, the shell room is unfortunately rather bereft of shells these days. There's just a few replicas sitting around in the racks instead of the several hundred there would have been originally. And it was after putting this one down that I discovered that they were plaster replicas. But what this section lacks in quantity of shells, it makes up for in quality. This is actually one of the most educational shell rooms I've seen in almost any museum, and that includes a lot of museum ships. Because as you can see here, they've got this diagram which is annotated with modern text, but the actual layout is taken pretty much from the operational manuals of the time, showing you all the different kinds of shell that could be found in here when this was operational, and a fairly detailed description of how they work. You can see the fusing mechanism, the total shell size, etc. And you can see we've got 2 different kinds of high explosive shell. The one with the green band uses TNT. Then in the middle, you've got the very pointy yellow APC shell. So that's the armor piercing capped shell. Then the first of the black shells is the CPC, or common pointed capped. In later periods, this might be known as a semi-armor piercing shell. So it combines some of the armor piercing capability of the APC round with a considerably larger payload in terms of explosive, closer to an HE round than an AP round. As a general rule of thumb, at least when the gun was designed in the 1900s, it was held that a AP round should be able to penetrate roughly its diameter in armor at the expected battle ranges, so around 9 inches. A CPC round was about 1/3 to 1/2 its diameter in armor. And so you can immediately see why the CPC round might have held a fair bit of attraction, because against a target using a 9.2-inch gun, that meant you could expect to penetrate somewhere between 3 and 4.5 inches of armor, which was more than most cruisers outside some of the better armored cruisers actually possessed, which meant you had the potential to do catastrophic damage to almost anything that was smaller than an armoured cruiser, or some of the less well-armoured ones. And then for battleships, if you have a 12 or 13.5-inch CPC shell, then you could reasonably expect 6-7 inches of penetration, which meant that you could use your CPC to do huge damage to anything that wasn't another battleship. Even, the vast majority of armoured cruisers wouldn't be able to resist it. with that huge amount of explosive the CPC carries. And even against other battleships, pretty much anything that wasn't the main armor belt, so your distributed armor scheme, would be very vulnerable to CPC shells, whereas the distributed armor scheme was obviously designed to repel HE fire, and the HE fire would splash harmlessly on a 3, 4, 5, 6 inch distributed armor belt. CPC shell will go straight through. But the all or nothing scheme kind of also saw the end of the CPC round. But since this is an older gun, even though this is the 1930s, CPC, technically speaking, is still available in some old stocks. And then on the right-hand section of that shell rack, you've also got shrapnel shells, because you might need to use those against troop transports, troop landings, etc., etc. They've also got this cut-through, which shows you one-to-one what the internal layout of an AP shell is actually like. So you've got the bit in red. That's the pointy end, that's the ballistic cap, that's purely there for aerodynamic purposes. It basically has zilch effect when it comes to actually penetrating armor. You then have the armor piercing cap, that's the bit in light grey. That's really the bit that helps you punch through the enemy armor belt itself. And then finally you have the core, and this is also part of the armor piercing section. So this is the sort of dark grey green bit at the bottom. So this works with the cap to help you penetrate enemy armor. And then any explosive charge is going to be in the base. That's not shown on this cut through, but is a really, really useful thing, and not something, as I say, that you see every day. Further on, they've got a kind of mini museum made up of various artifacts from the emplacement that they've salvaged and restored. And they've also got this, again, a mock-up of a cordite charge, but it shows you the silk bag lining and also shows you what cordite looks like. Now, most of you probably will know cordite comes in sticks of various thicknesses, depending on what size of charge you're using. But again, to help teach people who've probably never heard about this before or looked at it before and are maybe thinking of old school black powder or something, it's a really useful educational tool to point out, no, this is what cordite looks like. It is a series of sticks of propellant. They have the charge magazines as well, which obviously they have all the charges up on racks, the various cases. You can see one's been opened to show you what the charge looks like inside its case. And you've got the little viewing window there with its little glass pane. And they've obviously put a modern light to help shed light onto the whole situation. But this shows just how sensitive magazine security was taken, even with, relatively speaking, stable propellants. I know cordite and stable propellant might not seem to go together, but compared to black powder, it was much, much more stable. But you still have the old paned viewing window to allow you to check in on how your propellant is doing, as opposed to the shell rooms where you can just kind of walk in because it doesn't really matter too much. And this is the engine room dash generator room. So this is where power was made. So obviously, this would provide electrical power for lighting and also electrical power, as we mentioned earlier, to power the hydraulic motors in the gun mounts. But the actual engines themselves were taken away and scrapped long ago. So all you've got is the mountings where they used to be. But they've turned this into a very nice museum space where you've got, as I mentioned before, the various artifacts they've managed to recover and restore. And nearby is a door which leads you out of the bunker complex and to an abandoned section of the light railway. So this is where they would have brought up food, fuel, and other supplies to the central portion of the overall emplacement, from which obviously it could then be moved into the engine room or to the two gun batteries as and when you liked. Obviously, you do also have the railways running directly up to the gun batteries, which is what we used to get up there in the first place. And that pretty much wraps up our look at Rottnest Island. We'll take a quick pan around so you get an idea of the total view from the top of the remaining gun battery. And I can highly encourage a visit if you happen to be in Western Australia. And if you have family or a significant other to persuade to come with you to an island off the western coast of Australia to look at a bunch of old naval guns, you do of course have the Quokkas as well, which are kind of the main tourist attraction for Rottnest, if we're totally honest, amongst the general population. They're very cute. This was my favourite one. He or she decided it was going to sit on the park bench and happily eat a leaf and allowed me to film it quite up close, albeit I was using a zoom camera because of course you don't want to disturb them while they're at rest, or in this case, at eat, I suppose it would be. Anyway, thanks for watching.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.
Okay. Where are you going? You're not afraid of humans at all, are you?